Okay, we're going to look into the yew tree and its separate mythology and folklore than some of the other trees that are sacred in the Celtic rites. For we just got through looking at, hopefully you've seen the video, that there are quite a few. And this is but one of them, but we're going to go a little more into depth. I've kind of gone ahead and shot a lot of my bullets off, but then again, this will help pull it together and make a little bit more coherentness out of it. We've already talked about oak trees and so on, elderberry wine and their trees, ash and Ash Wednesday and how it connects to things. And so, like the squirrel in Yggdrasil, I'm going to bring about another message. In the first of three excerpts from the Work of the Dead, A Cultural History of Immortal Remains, Thomas Lacour explores the necrobotany of the yew tree, the tree of the dead, found in churchyards across the United Kingdoms, France, and Spain. Now, necrobotany is kind of like, archaeobotany is ancient plants and where they are and what's going on, and you may even look all the way back into dinosaur times to see what's going on in pollens and things. But necrobotany is plants that are used in rituals going along with generally burials and death rites and things like that. Things all the way from Egypt and the stuff that they use to bury them, which, by the way, shows some oddness in tobacco and cocaine and weird things that went along with that in that one video that we talked about. Actually, I mentioned it in a couple others, but other sacred plants and stuff, and you see, and even Jesus being talked about how these plants and these things that are brought in that are sacred to go with a burial and in certain rites, and so that kind of goes along with necrobotany, if you will. Kind of a beautiful picture here where you can see some weeping willows hanging up over an ancient English site. It says it's the villa at Twickenham in 1808. And there's a bunch of sheep out there right near the lake. A churchyard was adjacent to a church, and both held the bones of the dead in the church and out in the yard. Sacred people in the building and others in the yard. The three, the building, the ground, and the dead, were conjoined by a common history that made them part of what the 18th century was given. If ever there were an organic landscape, it was the churchyard. And you can see an odd connection here between someone who churchyard and gods are called, the priests are called father, right? And so we'd be sons of the church and sons of God. And then you have a Holy Spirit or the Holy Spirits that have done this before you, and a lineage. And there we have a triad of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Indeed, we can echo this one more way and say, you only can remember pretty much to your grandparents, and anything past that ditches away, and that's the same way it was in olden times as it is now, pretty much. And so in memory, what you have is your Father, and you're the Son, and the Holy Spirit that's remembered before you. Of course, women can do this in a feminine manner in this exact same way, but it's the symbolism and an idea that goes between that too. And when we look at it as the gods and how they went through their time, it was the God and the Son of the God, and and they went through it, and the Jesus story is the same thing. But let's look into this. The long-lived European yew tree, Taxia baccata, named after Bacchus, the tree of the dead, the tree of poisonous seeds, bears witness to the antiquity of the churchyard and shades its rugged elms and the mounds of the furrows of its graves. The yew of legend is an old and lays claim to immemorial presence. So in other words, it goes back before recorded time, and you see people having in the churchyards, and you don't understand why, but churches were built around sacred trees at one time. We'll get into that a little bit. We're speaking here of 2 or 3 dozen exemplary giants, some with the circumference of 10 meters, that have stood for between 1,300 and 3,000 years, but also of many more modest and historically documented trees that have lived and been memorialized for centuries. Certain people realize in a town too, there's that ancient oak tree. It's up on the square and they keep it, and how old is that oak tree, and all these type of things. At least 250 used today are as old or older than the churchyards in which they stand. Some were there when the first Saxon and indeed the first British Christian wattled churches were built. A 7th century charter from Peronne in Picardy speaks of preserving the yew on the sides of a new church. So it's to be protected in the earliest of rites. Just how ancient any given tree might be is and was a matter of controversy. Estimates depending on having 2 or more measurements of girth over a long period of time and then applying a formula that projected rates of growth back into time and growth rings and so on. These formulas were in turn derived from other serial measurements, so many feet and so many years and things like that, supplemented by girth measurements of trees whose age was known from written evidence. And so they compared the two and say, yeah, okay, it's about like this. And we've done the same thing for these redwoods, for you don't want to chop one down and then count the rings and go, yeah, we were right. Hey, Jim, you won, because you've killed the tree. So anyhow, supplemental by girth measurements of trees whose age was known from written evidence. In fact, precise dating is probably impossible, and everyone acknowledged it. There are too many variables that determines a tree's rate of growth to derive a reliable ratio for changes in girth per decade. But no one questions that yews live thousands of years. Most trees look older than they are in reality when they get old, says dendrologist Alan Michael, except for yews, which are even older than they look. They have been an inanimate part of the churchyard for time out of mind. They are trees of the deep past. Their history vouches for the antiquity of the ecclesiastical landscape. The 19th century antiquarian Daniel Rock speculates that the yew tree in the Aldworth, Berkshire churchyard may well have been planted by the Saxons themselves. John Evelyn, the 17th century diarist and writer on forestry, measured that tree. Augustin Primus de Candolle in 1778-1841, the famous Swiss botanist, measured it again a century later and diffused the difference to calculate age circumference ratios. Rock himself measured it in 1841 and noted that it had grown a yard in girth since it was noted in Beauties of England in 1760. Scores of other ancient churchyard yews have their own well-documented histories. These are celebrities of the species that give voice to the antiquity of the churchyard and its dead. Thousands of ordinary yews share in the aura of the species. There was no jay until well after the 1300s. It is beneath the yew tree's shade that heaves the turf in many mouldering heap, as Thomas Gray's elegy written in A Country Churchyard puts it. Taxus baccata almost invariably casts its shadow where the dead are, on the south and west sides of the church. Like the bodies it watches over, it is rarely found on the north side, and then only in exceptional circumstances. Some believe suggested Robert Turner, the strange, learned, and prodigious 17th century translator of many mystical and medico-chemical texts, said that this is because yews branches would draw and imbibe the gross and oleaginous vapors exhaled out of the graves by the setting sun, and so the spirits of the dead and the stench of the dead, if you will. And they have a fragrance smell. It's a pine tree type of thing. They also might prevent the appearance of ghosts or apparitions. Unabsorbed gases produced by the ignis fatui, the foolish fire, like that which travelers saw over bogs and marshes, and these, in the context of churchyards, could be mistaken for dead bodies walking. Superstitious monks, he continues, believed that the yew could drive away devils, and so it would hang around in the churchyard and absorb anything bad that happened, almost like a ward. Its roots, he thought, were poisonous because they will run and suck nourishment from the dead, whose flesh is the rankest poison that could be. But Turner's fanciful claims about the yew's ecological adaptation are a bit post hoc. The more basic question is why the yew was so intimately associated with the dead in the first place. And like all questions that seek mythic beginnings, it is unanswerable, or whether it is too many answers. The yew tree was sacred to Hecate, the Greek goddess associated with witchcraft, death, and necromancy. It was said to purify the dead as they entered Hades. The 1st century poet Statius, much quoted by 19th century folklorists, says that the ocular hero Amphiaraus, struck by Zeus's thunderbolt, was snatched so quickly from life that not yet had the Fury, who lived in a yew grove, met and purified him yet with the branch of a yew, nor had Proserpine marked him on the dusky door-post as admitted to the company of the dead. Now, a strange thing is that it tells you that they used it in funeral rites, just straightforward. But also, instead of Persephone, the name is written Proserpine, and that's just telling as hell. But we're going to leave that alone and just walk off. Druids associated with the tree with dead rituals. In fact, it was the long pagan history of trees that caused the leaders of the Catholic Counter-Reformation to ban their planting altogether, and motivated some. An early 17th century bishop of Rennes was a famous case, like Rennes-le-Château, to try unsuccessfully in the face of popular opposition to ban the yew in particular. Post-Reformation English clergy made no such efforts. 17th and 17th century poets tell us that the yew leaf covered graves and anointed bodies. The full Feste in Twelfth Night sings of his shroud of white, struck all with yew. And this was commonplace in antiquarian histories, and so was the yew's association with the story of Christ's Passion itself, with Ash Wednesday and Palm Sunday. So few trees were so rooted in the deep time of the dead, and so yew trees had a big connection. And I spoke in the last video how it was said that wherever an elf had died in ancient times, that a yew tree would spring up, and because of their prowess with bows and things of that nature, that's why people used that tree to make sacred bows out of and stuff. And because of their association with the rebirth of the elves and the concept, people used it also in their dead rituals. But the same mocking of the same type of using the branches and so on goes all the way through the Middle East into Samaria, the ancient groves of the cedars they have there, and in Lebanon itself, in Anatolia, where the Galatians and Gauls had made itself too. And it shows you the full connection that was going on at this time, that's now been all poured in the soup together. And they're still calling it one soup, but it needs a little bit longer of a name now. Seems like whenever I look back at things like this, that what we're actually doing is people are saying that there was no cars before the Corvette, and it all starts at Corvettes. And I'm like, man, there's some cars before the Corvettes y'all aren't even talking about. Sure, that was a great milestone there, but I mean, wow, y'all are just ditching everything. And then people come up arguing about Model Ts and stuff, and I'm like, man, there was cars before that and handmade. That was just an automated situation. There was, and Benz and the cars before that, and all those, incredibly gorgeous cars. But then again, a lot of those cars almost looked the same, didn't they? Yeah, except for a grill and the headlight placements and things like that. In fact, that still goes on, kind of twisted a little bit in the middle, but it kind of looks that way today too, where sometimes you have to go up and look at a headlight or a tail light and go, oh, okay. So here we look at something that looks like an elder churchyard, and out in front of it are two sacred trees. For I see a yew tree and I see a weeping willow. And so what has weeping willows got to do with it? Well, let's see if I got enough time to go into it. Yay, let's go. In the early 18th century, a rival unburdened by a long history appeared in Europe, the weeping willow. It got to England from China via Syria because of a merchant named Aleppo, who became famous, and places are named Thomas Vernon, gave one to Peter Collinson, the most important middleman in the global exchange of plants. He in turn gave the specimen to Alexander Pope for his gardens at Twickenham, sometime in the early 1720s. There are variants to this story, but Vernon's was Pope's landlord and so may have given it to him directly. It may have appeared in England a little bit earlier, but the weeping willow was undeniably new and foreign in the 18th century, and early ones like Pope's enjoyed the attention paid to a new tree in town. Salix babylonica was the name given to this tree for a reason, by Carl Linnaeus. And if you know anything about naming of things and ancient, archaeological naming of things, Linnaeus is very famous. And we talked about me being into fish and stuff, and there are even fish named after this man. For he's one of the 4 or 5 guys that really stood out in getting things and taxonomies figured out and straightened out a little more. Anyhow, Carl Linnaeus, though, named it mistakenly, thinking it to be the tree of lamentation that was in Psalms 137, where it says, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. And it actually could have been a tree like that, but he can be forgiven for his mistake. The taxonomy of willows is, as the leading expert tells us, perplexing. True Salix babylonica is fragile in cold climates, and may now be extinct. So our modern weeping willow is one of its few cultivars, Salix sepulchralis, and a cross that we're getting from that, produced by crossing it with European white willows, which is Salix alba, alba meaning white as an albino and things like that. The willow weeps and mourns, perhaps because of its drooping leaves, or because it was mistakenly called the tree of the ancient Hebrews in Lamentations, but we can see that effigy into it. I'll interject it now. In my childhood, of course, Fleetwood Mac and Stevie Nicks, and She's a Gypsy and all that type of stuff. But in their famous song, she talks about, there I was, I came to you in a dream. I was a willow tree bent over you over a fresh running stream. Da 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 da. Crazy on you, I think it is. But you can see that type of mystical thing in there. And of course, I'm studying this whenever I'm a kid, and then that comes on the radio and stuff as something new, and I'm like, man, these people know everything. It must. I mean, and of course, there's a lot of satanic music back then and all this type of stuff, and they all had stuff about all this mythological things too going on. And I'm like, oh my gosh, everybody's studying this, right? Come to find out, nobody I knew was studying it, but it seemed like all these people knew it. And there's my Journey album cover, and it's got the scarab onto it with the wing thing and da-da-da. And I look in Sumerians, and then I've got this book about Mithra over here, and he's in the wing disc, and this guy's in the wing disc. And I'm like, what the hell's going on here? Let me spend some time getting into it. So I have for a while. Anyhow, however it got its name, this weeping willow, or whatever its precise genealogy, it is the horticultural opposite of Taxus baccata. So kind of like not the evergreen tree in any way, shape, or form. And so here we have another odd connotation. It's shallow-rooted, short-lived, and without historical baggage until Alexander Pope made it famous. His villa was torn down in 1808, not a century after the weeping willow had arrived, because the new owner was tired of tourists. The painter J.M.W. Turner painted its ruins and saw the famous tree, now a dying trunk, and wrote of it, Hope's willow, bending to the earth, forgot, save one weak scion by my fostering care, nursed into life, which fell on bracken spare, on the lone bank to mark the spot with pride. Tens of thousands of scions were sent forth from the Twickenham before the sad end of Pope's tree. So in other words, here we go again with that Johnny Appleseed situation. And indeed, we had one just right up the street from us in somebody's front yard that they had planted whenever their grandparents owned the house. Now that thing was huge, and during the summer it would get to the point where it would hang down almost to the ground, but not quite, and you could go all inside of it right around the tree trunk, and you felt like you were inside of somebody's giant air mop type of thing. It was wicked. Then all of a sudden it would drop all of its stuff, and man, what a mess. Just like the ones that have the little propellers on them and so on like that. But images of Salix biblionica are perhaps Salix sepulchralis mix, the funeral willow, as it's called, decorated for the new commercial funeral announcements and mourning memorabilia of the 18th and 19th centuries. It shaded Rousseau's grave at Ermenville. Gloom, thought by John Claudius Loudon, the most learned horticulturist of the 19th century, was the natural expression of the yew tree, melancholy, that of weeping willow. Its drooping branches made it a natural sign of sorrow. Within a century, the foreigner without a history became the iconic tree of the park-like cemeteries of the 19th century. It was the tree not of the immemorial dead, but of mourning. And so you can see this mourning tree that works with the weeping willow and how it all kind of goes together. And you don't think we still have this symbolically in things going on today, but it's all over the place. It was the tree not of the immemorial dead, but of mourning, the tree not for the ages, but for the 3 generations for which the dead can hope to be remembered. Again, I recall my father and his grandfather, and I know stories of his great grandfather, and I saw a picture. And if we were at a time before pictures, what you would know is from you being little when your granddad was extremely old, him passing away, perhaps in your life, may be the thing that taught you about death. And we continue. In my life, it was my mama was the very first one. And I still didn't really understand at that point. I knew she was gone. Anyhow, so this is an excerpt from a book, The Work of the Dead by Thomas LaCour, though. And he's got a few other books out, a couple of them with some strange titles to him, too. But he apparently is a researcher in doing this, and I thought it'd be a good thing to read out of it. After I read it, I thought I could add to it somewhat. And if I would have left all my guns to this video, it would have made it real sparkly, but I think it would have taken away from the other one. For now, we know a lot more about the yew tree and its sacredness, and the weeping willow and what it signifies, and how now maybe whenever you ever go to a funeral, which I hope you don't ever have to, you might recognize and see large oaks, conifer type trees, and evergreens or yew trees, and weeping willows. Like, share, and subscribe, guys. Peace. Enjoy. Much more to come.